record on this computer.
There you go.
There you go.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm glad you could all come today. This is about Project Venona. What was Project Venona? During 1943, for various reasons, during the Second War, the American Signal Intelligence Service started to break into Soviet communications between Soviet agents who were in the United States legitimately, and some who were not. Some who were here legitimately to administer Lend-Lease and the Soviet Union. And there are various reasons why they started to look into that. But the messages, while the SIS thought they would reveal ordinary consular traffic, passports and that sort of thing, revealed instead a very extensive, as Hans and Claire called it, a very extensive Soviet espionage effort against the United States of the type one directs against an enemy state. And with the aid of the Communist Party USA, they had penetrated the State Department, very secret agencies within the United States government, including the Manhattan Project and the code-breaking agencies. This was a counterintelligence nightmare. Now, Project Venona, however, was problematic because the Soviets were referring to people by cover names and applying a lot of very specific spycraft. So essentially, the broken messages did not unambiguously identify the many individuals. It did identify an enormous security problem. And, it has been very controversial because it's one thing to say that, for example, that Frank Jones was spied for the Soviet Union. It's quite another to tackle a project in living memory, in which you're saying that Uncle Frank was probably a spy for the Soviet Union. So it's a very, very heated discussion even now. A lot of people have charged that the project was inspired McCarthyism or was McCarthyism. That is, it essentially accused individuals of being spies based on very little or incomplete evidence. Whereas if you look at the messages themselves, you see that they're very ambiguous. In order to identify someone as a Soviet agent, you had to do a lot of old-fashioned investigation and gumshoeing. And Venona offered corroboration. It very seldom made an accusation that could be borne out. So I'd like to, in outline, speak again today about what was Venona and why did it lead to a significant revision of 20th century history, because it has had quite effect. I'd like first to lay out the historical context of Venona, that is, why did it start? For those who might be interested in how the codes were assembled, I'll briefly discuss why did the Soviets have confidence in their enciphered codes and how were they partially compromised. And then I'll point out something that's very important to understanding the importance of Venona, which was that not many messages were decrypted, and only a small time frame of messages were decrypted. Now, rather than just describe them, I will then show some examples of Venona decrypts. And I want to speak for a couple of minutes about an example of critical events that were revealed in part by Venona. That is essentially Soviet espionage and the Manhattan Project. This is an example of how critical events were revealed in Venona. I'd like to discuss and open up for discussion afterwards, how does Venona change our understanding of domestic and international events in this century? And I'd like to close with some comments reading Venona as history. By the way, unless otherwise cited, all illustrations are from Wikipedia. I got the Venona decrypts from a publication by the NSA. So let's set the scene. This is the context. The war in Europe in early 1943. The Allies, principally the US, the UK, and the USSR, were fighting the Axis. The Axis had Germany had invaded the USSR. The USSR was bearing the brunt of the fighting as measured by the number of people involved and the number of people being killed. The Soviet Union furiously resented the US and the UK for failing to open a second front in Europe, whatever the difficulties there were to doing that, and there were many. And in the Soviet perception, FDR had promised they would open up a second front in 1942. These are historically known as Operation Sledgehammer and Roundup, and it's generally agreed by historians they would have been a disaster if they had come off. But the Soviets had lost 4.5 million people, had 4.5 million casualties in the first 6 months. They really were bearing the brunt of the fighting, and by the end of the war, 80% of German combat deaths occurred on the Eastern Front. People tend to forget what a principal role Soviets bore in actually doing the fighting. Now, at this time in 1943, the Allies feared, it turned out with some reason, that the Soviets would make a separate peace with the Nazis. That is, that after Stalingrad, when they had gone on the offensive, that is, they would turn to Germany and say, you won't win, but it will be very bloody for us to fight you going back the other way. So how about we compromise? And US and UK policymakers repeatedly expressed the fear that this would happen in memos. The OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA, reported these talks, and there even were some reports in Swedish newspapers that they were occurring. And here's a paper I found by V. Masny, who describes this in some detail. And of course, there was precedent in the Stalin-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. The Soviets and the Germans had actually made a pact which astonished the world. How did these, bitter enemies suddenly end up on the same side? Maybe the reverse could happen. So again, after the Battle of Stalingrad, the Russians went on the offensive, and there was a massive offensive against the Germans back. In contrast, the US and the UK at that time, in early 1943, had only engaged on what the Soviets thought was the enemy's periphery, that is, in North Africa and in the Pacific. The USSR had fought off the Japanese attacks in Mongolia and did not fear further attacks, partly because they had good spies. So the Soviets were wondering if the US and the UK were purposely waiting for the USSR to exhaust itself against the Nazis. It's necessary to do one other piece of scene setting. The Soviets had invaded Finland just after the outbreak of the war, and they fought sort of a seesaw campaign back and forth through Finland in 1939, which it eventually won. But the Finns were tough. They put up a very good resistance, and they were also good cryptographers, and they had some of their initial successes partly on the basis of their ability to read Soviet codes. During the war, the US read reports that the Finns were sharing with Japan, the enemy of my ally is my enemy, and post-war, some partially burnt Soviet code books that had been incompletely destroyed that the Finns had captured came into American and British hands through mysterious channels. So it seems that both of these factors, the hopes that breaking the Soviet ciphers would give you advance warning of Soviet Nazi talks, and also this potentiating knowledge from the Finns, led the Signal Intelligence Service of the US to try and break the Soviet ciphers starting on February 1943. Again, they thought that they would, if they were successful, decipher routine consular traffic. Now, this might not be wonderful for intelligence purposes, but it might give you advance notice of a Soviet Nazi pact, i.e., explain this to the rest of the people in the embassy. So, what type of crypto system were the Soviets using in the Second War? In the First War, they had used crummy or no crypto systems, and they got clobbered on account. Many of their troops were illiterate. That is, by 1937, the literacy rate had improved, but was still only about 75%. So the Soviets adopted a real simple system called a one-time system. It has advantages and it has disadvantages. In theory, as long as the additives you use in the system, which is a long string of random numbers or letters, is truly random, the system is in theory unbreakable, and it's also real easy to use. The problem is you really need a huge volume of random numbers, because you need a volume of random numbers or letters that's as long as the length of what you're trying to encrypt. And because the Russians had been caught flat-footed by the Germans during the invasion, suddenly their message text skyrocketed. So during the war, they sent 200,000 to 300,000 messages. You can imagine that they needed a huge volume of one-time pads. So here's an example on the right hand of the slide. This one is from the NSA, but in this example, it's just a long series of random letters. And you could also make the list of random letters quite small. This was one used by Soviet spies in the US. So what happened? In late 1942, someone somewhere in the cryptographic establishment in the USSR, in order to keep up with a very fast increasing demand, started to bind duplicate one-time pad sheets into many additive books. Effectively, parts of some one-time pads became many-time pads. This eventually involved about 35,000 duplicate one-time pads. And we knew something about Soviet codes because at the right is a decrypt of a message from a Japanese ambassador in which he's reporting information on how Soviet codes are constructed, which he got from the Finns, and the Japanese attaché is reporting back to Moscow. So we knew something, but not a lot, about how the Soviets encoded stuff. The Allies caught the Russians at this mistake by statistical analysis in late 1943. And this was a pretty significant achievement, because you have to know how the messages are constructed, and the process is extremely laborious. This forced error that the Soviets did allowed the NSA to put some coded messages in depth, and over the course of the years, it was very slowly possible to build up an understanding of the underlying code. Information from the Finns allowed the NSA to sort intercepted messages into groups that might be enciphered with the same one-time pads, which actually were now many-time pads. How did they do this? The Soviets would write a message like this: Pilot, which is a code name, delivered a report about rockets. The Soviet code clerk would look up in their book the number corresponding to each word. And these were 4-digit numbers from a code book that listed what you wanted to say and gave you a number for that word. Then you would turn those 4-digit numbers into 5-digit numbers. This had the effect of straddling code groups so that if you used one very often in a message, it would not be so obvious. Then the really brilliant thing is from the one-time pad, they would write below these groups a long series of pseudo-random numbers from the lists. And they would add those numbers to the code groups by non-carrying addition. That is, 7 and 5 give you 12. You drop the 1 and write 2. 9 and 9, sorry, I'm doing this incorrectly. 7, which group? Oh, this group. That's right. Where am I? Oh, yes, okay. So here's the random number. 7 and 5 is 12, so I write 2. 9 and 9, this is 1 and 5 is, which one am I doing?
I don't know.
This was so clear initially when I wrote it out. And what the? Well, anyway, you add them together by non-carrying addition and you proceed that way through the entire message. So now you have a string of numbers and you want to tell the code clerk on the other side, I started this on page 264, position 73. So I write this down and then I write it at the head of the message. And then there's usually a telegraph code which converts numbers into letters because it's easier for a telegraph operator to send those without errors. And there's a message serial number at the end of it, so you know which message came after which other one. That was a darn good system. If they had really used a one-time pad for all these pseudo-random numbers, it would have been unbreakable. The way that in outline, the way it was broken was determining what the additive was only the first stage of the decryption. You had to find out which message was encrypted with which one of the duplicate one-time pad sheets. If so, which duplicate one-time pad sheet was it? So briefly, analysts subtracted via non-carrying subtraction the beginnings of messages from others that they thought contained the same code groups. That is, that implies they were using the same one-time pads. The equation in non-carrying subtraction looks like this. So now you have a difference in code group numbers with the additive completely discarded. Then you would look for sets of messages where the same code groups applied in the same places. This is the equivalent of the words and the in English, because those were probably enciphered with the same one-time pad. They then used knowledge of the indicator systems to record which one-time pads were duplicates. So now going forward, they could look at a message and decide if it was worth any effort at all. Once they had unenciphered code groups and stripped away the additive, they had to slowly build up knowledge of what the code groups meant. For instance, what does 1, 2, 3, 4 mean? It means a certain word. You have to do this from context, and this practice is very time-consuming. It's known as book building. Usually, as Chris Christensen told us, when you have a huge volume of super enciphered code, it's easy to do book building, but it takes months. When you're working with very small amounts of text, which these people were, it can take a very long time. Here's the team, particularly Meredith Gardner, who broke into the system. Cecil Phillips here, visiting the United Kingdom, had a critical insight into how you interpreted the indicators. One thing that makes the story a bit creepy is this is a picture of William Weisbund, who it turns out was a Soviet spy at the NSA. So Meredith Gardner recalls that while he was in the process of breaking a critical message, William Weisband was looking over his shoulder. So it's not as if the Soviets didn't know that this was happening. This is a very important slide. because how many did the messages did the NSA actually decipher? How completely and over what period in Venona? Over the span of years 1944 all the way up into 1980, Venona deciphered about 2,900 messages or 5,000 pages of text. And this was in three categories. Trade, that is legitimate messages involving trade with the Soviet purchasing agency and Lend-Lease. Diplomatic, which was the Soviet foreign ministry talking to its agents. But most of these messages were directed to officers of the KGB, the State Security Agency, or the GRU, which is military intelligence. Most of this was spy traffic. The Russians stopped using the duplicate one-time pad sheets completely in 1948 when they finally were told, where they found out that this was happening. But usage dropped off very rapidly after the end of the war. The NSA read mostly messages originating between late 1942 and late 1944. That's very important. They have only 2 or 3 years of text. The first break into the messages was in December 46, that is after the war was over, and most messages were read after 1946. So this is ex post facto decryption. Decryption was very slow and very laborious. The messages, which I'll show that they were only partly decrypted. This was due to the fact that the Russians were sensitive to what they were doing, and the one-time pad sheets that they made duplicates of were interspersed at random within the packets of one-time sheets that they produced. So some of the messages would be, some parts of the messages would be readable, but the next word or two might not. They would go over into another sheet. So there are messages that I'll show have long stretches of text that are still unrecoverable. That is, a small fraction of all the messages sent were decrypted. The champion, the one the NSA was most successful at, was 49% of the messages in 1944 between the KGB in New York and Moscow, and only 15% from 1943, and only 1.8% from 1942. So in later debates, both sides of debates, I think, consistently underappreciate the fact that you are looking at a small amount of text, in small stretches. It was as if you would go through a newspaper at random with a scissors and cut out text. Even so, that turned out to show some very, very surprising and very, very disturbing things. Soviet espionage was very sophisticated. Once a message was broken, a lot of digging was necessary to know what it meant. To read one was often not to understand the message. And I'll show examples. I'll show you why that's true. Many people were referred to by code names in messages. For instance, liberal or link. So you needed to have a lot of ancillary information to identify them. For instance, liberal, later Antenna's wife's first name was Ethel, and she was 29 years old in 1943. And liberal, or this liberal Antenna, the same person, had visited Washington to meet a certain name, also codenamed, between certain dates. That's the sort of information you had to piece together. Very importantly, Elizabeth and Bentley and William I can't quite see that. And Whittaker Chambers were two Communist Party members who were Soviet spies, and they both decided that this was a bad idea and confessed to running Soviet spy networks in the US in the 1930s and 1940s. And these people's confession led to the identification of many people who were spying for the USSR. And in fact, they had very good memories and they had served as couriers to all the networks. So in fact, by the late 1940s, almost all the Soviet networks were rolled up. Simultaneous surveillance of many contacts and suspects was necessary. Now, I'd like to give you an example. Here, let's see if I can move this. Why can't I move the toolbar out of the way? So this is some examples of espionage against the US Manhattan Project. And this is the timeline if you only knew about Venona. Venona identified 2 spies, and it later identified David Greenglass and the Rosenbergs. But according to the timeline in Venona, this was the extent of espionage against the Manhattan Project. Whereas what I'd like to emphasize in the next 2 slides is that was a small part of the story. In fact, the Soviets were aware of the Manhattan Project, which is billed as our deepest, darkest secret during the war, as early as 1940. And Fuchs started spying in September 1941, and there were many other sources for information for the Soviets within the Manhattan Project that Venona made no mention of. So I can call out some in particular, like Alan Nunn-May, who is a Canadian physicist, and the subsequent defection of a Soviet code clerk allowed the Canadians to pursue many, many spies within the Manhattan Project. Importantly, the material obtained via espionage launched the Soviet program in earnest. The Soviets started to work on their own version of the Manhattan Project, on their own nuclear weapon, long after they discovered that the Allies were seeking it, in part because they didn't have many resources. They were fighting cats and dogs with the Germans. A second list of spies is there were humble secretaries within the National Research Council, which made many classified reports available to the Soviets. The Communist Party USA was trying to recruit a chemistry professor at the University of California. And sometime in 1944, they acquired another spy at Los Alamos. Guessing the number of Soviet sources within the Manhattan Project is sort of like playing a game the older of us might remember when stores would display big bowls full of beans, and they'd ask you to guess the number of beans in the jar. People are still guessing the number of beans in the jar, but it was very, very extensive. For instance, Oscar Seaborer, the 4th spy at Los Alamos, was revealed only within the last couple of years. It's also important to realize that the Soviet bomb designers, they were producing a copy of the American design. This was not because they didn't know how to do better. Their own physicists had come up with, were irritated because they would not use more sophisticated designs, but because the Soviets had a paranoia that anything they did that didn't match us exactly wouldn't work. The information from Soviet spies was also important after the war, because whereas the Americans were trying to overawe the Soviets in the early part of the Cold War with superior nuclear weapons, Klaus Fuchs' information revealed that the US had only a few bombs, and it was really a paper tiger in that respect. One further example of things that Venona revealed were that messages showed, and this was one of the first messages decrypted, that the Soviets had even penetrated the super secret code-breaking operations at Bletchley Park. They had no active agent within that apparatus, but they did eventually have people on the distribution list for Enigma, and they did have one of the Cambridge Five, John Cairncross, who visited Bletchley in 1942 and presumably reported all about it. So let's look at some examples of Venona messages. I hope you can read this. This is a message here on the left part of the slide. This is the text that was decrypted that reported this, very rare in the Venona files, because this is a very singular example of a message that is very clear and unambiguous about who is identified as spying. The text of the message very clearly calls out Theodore Hall with the name spelled out completely. And the agent who is writing it recommends that they go ahead and talk to this guy. This guy volunteered. He walked into their offices, plunked down a report on the Manhattan Project, and offered to report further information. They checked his particulars and they showed that he had been a member of the Young Communist League and that his mother was a member of the Communist Party. So this is important because it's important to realize the Russians were vetting people very carefully, and membership in the domestic Communist Party, the Communist Party of the USA, was very important. This is much more a factor in later messages, but it's also important to realize, underlined in red, that there are a couple of groups they can't read. But this is a rare example of a virtually unambiguous identification in a message that is almost all in the clear. The second message is an example of how they this is an incompletely deciphered message about Klaus Fuchs and Gold, who was a courier. So the things I wanted to point out here, this is the large blocks of text, 71 groups, 46 groups, are not recovered. So only about half this message is readable. And of the 100 messages I have seen, this is typical. So this was by a surveilled Soviet KGB agent under diplomatic cover, so you know the FBI was watching him. And they accepted Fuchs as a source principally because he had been a communist for a long time, as this message reveals. Here's an example of the very complete vetting they had done. So the first thing to realize is this is a relatively clear message because there are only strings of 15 or 45 groups that are non-recoverable. But one agent is reporting he's trying to recruit this other lady as a source, and he gives the Moscow very specific information, even though he refers to her by as a code name. He refers to her simply as belonging to the Communist Party from some time, and that he really wants to recruit her because of her husband, who works at Camp 2, which is Los Alamos, a very important site in the Manhattan Project. I also want to emphasize that there were many people who were Soviet sources in very many parts of the American government that were obscure. For instance, they had one source. I am transmitting the main points of report of the Board of Economic Warfare. And you would wonder, how relevant is that? How much information can that give us about how we fight the war? And it turns out that the information passed in this message, if you read it carefully, permits guesses at German strategy, i.e. a full-scale offensive by the Germans is beyond their abilities. And this is in 1943. And this is very important information to the Soviets. I'm showing you messages first that are relatively easy to read, so only blocks of 26, 1 and 2 groups have been unrecovered. That is about 29 groups versus about 430 words. Here is one of the most tantalizing messages of Venona. There were Soviet sources, sometimes people who reported everything, sometimes people who reported only what they wanted to report to the Soviets in many parts of the US government. There are 2 code names who we never have been able to identify, 19 and Samastidal. And this message is very unnerving because it says 19 reports that Kapitan, which turns out to refer to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Kaban, which turns out to be Churchill, invited him into a conversation and were discussing something of intense interest to the Soviets, that is, when there would be a second front in Europe. And it also contains the information that one of those agents thinks that the other isn't informing the other agent of important military decisions. So whoever these agents were, FDR and Bohr trusted them enough to invite them into a private conversation. The identities of these people have never been ascertained. As you'll see from the handwritten note on the message, some people even speculated that Harry Hopkins, FDR's close age, was in fact being 19. It's still not clear. There's no evidence that is very clear on that. His name was spelled out in other messages, which makes it unlikely he was an agent, because then his agent number would have been used. The other thing to note about this message is that it contains about 100 words and 101 unrecovered groups. Since a group can refer to one word or to many words, that means that the message is less than half recovered. But this is an example, this message, of one of the many historical puzzles that has been left to us by Venona, and an example of one of those puzzles that people still labor to unfold. Here's an example of the fact that being mentioned in Venona is not necessarily the same thing as being a source. The subject, William Lippmann, who is a famous newspaper columnist, is referred to, by the way, as imperialist. I think that's a wry choice of words. He expressed no sympathy for communism and would have been an unlikely recruit. A Soviet agent is reporting a conversation in this message in which Lippmann gives his opinions about domestic and international events. The Russians thought his opinions were very important because they considered him very well informed with a lot of his own contacts within the government. They even inserted a spy into his office as a secretary, but apparently she was unable to yield him much. And the only other thing I want to point out was this is much more typical of a Venona message in the fact that it contains about 300 words and 232 unrecovered groups. That is, it's been about half translated. And finally, this is an example of how, yeah, the messages were very fragmentary in group. Indeed, this message contains 50 words and nearly 200 unrecovered groups. But even at this scale, there could still be information that was important. That is, there's one clear sentence in this message. Anvil has been postponed until August 15th. Anvil was a code word for the American British invasion of southern France. So yeah, it's only one sentence, one few words among several hundred, but yes, since it was in the clear, it was valuable to the Soviets. So that will give you a feel for what kind of information was available from the Venona messages. I'd like to focus on what they found out specifically about the Manhattan Project. Don't pay too much attention to this eye candy because I'm looking at it carefully. It's about 3 different radiograph movies plus a still photograph run together, and one of the radiographs shows a partially unsuccessful implosion. So it must have been an early product of the Manhattan Project. Venona, by itself, identified only 2 spies in the Manhattan Project. Everything else had to be pieced together. It identified Klaus Fuchs, providing strong evidence that he was a spy, and it was obtained before 1950. And it was successful at that not because Klaus Fuchs' name was included or spelled out, simply because there weren't very many possibilities of people who fit the established fact pattern. Theodore Hall may be the only person who is unambiguously identified as a spy, as who obtained after World War II. Venona provided corroborating evidence for all of these 3 people, but basically prior confessions was most important. It's necessary to note that Fuchs and Hall did much more damage at a more crucial stage than Greenglass and Rosenberg. It was often claimed that Rosenberg gave the Soviets the secrets of the A-bomb, whereas history shows they played a subsidiary role. The information provided by Klaus Fuchs and Theodore Hall was much more important earlier. It was a counterintelligence nightmare in part because the spies were ideological. That is, they volunteered their information. That had both advantages and disadvantages because few of the people were disciplined or practiced habits of secrecy or tradecraft. And when confronted, they generally fully confessed. So how do you distinguish a dangerous Communist Party member or progressive from an innocuous person? It had been suspected and maintained by the CPUSA that it was independent of Moscow, but information obtained after the war showed that CPUSA took direction from Moscow and was involved in espionage. So it was an equation that one-time CPUSA members of the Communist Party of the USA might well equal spies, but it wasn't clear. The espionage done against the Manhattan Project was fairly damaging because Soviet espionage shortened the time that the USSR needed to develop its own bomb by people estimate between 1 and 4 years. That's an interesting historical contingency because if there had not been Soviet espionage, if they had not been able to reach American results, they might have taken a bit longer. And it's just possible that the bomb might have arrived for them after Stalin was dead, which is an interesting counter-historical speculation. Then one wonders whether the Korean War would even have happened. Now we have to talk about the security impact of Venona. As Haynes and Clare say, the USSR's unrestrained espionage against the US was of a type which a nation directs at an enemy state. And this caused both American high counterintelligence professionals and high-level policymakers to conclude that Stalin had already launched a covert attack on the US. In their minds, Soviet espionage showed that the Cold War had begun not after World War II, but many years before, that is, before 1942. On their side, the Soviets knew that both the US and the UK had been keeping nuclear materials away from the USSR since 1944. And the Russians remembered all too well the military intervention by the US and the UK against the Bolsheviks in 1919. So they were already quite convinced that we were their adversaries. Historians list many Americans and US residents as having a covert relation with Soviet intelligence agencies, and we'll get into what that means later. Haynes and Clare say that 349 sources have been identified from Venona as American citizens, or were referred to as American citizens. As of today, we've identified about half those. Historians have identified about half of those cover names.
Hey, Dave,
Yeah.
what were Operation Pike and Unthinkable, do you know?
Oh, Pike and Unthinkable. I'm sorry. Thank you for catching me on that. Operation Pike was while the Russians and Germans were allies. That is, before the Germans turned on the Russians and attacked them. Operation Pike was an operation planned by the British to bomb the oil fields in the Soviet Union to keep them from supplying the Nazi war machine.
Okay.
It never took place, but it was planned, and the Russians knew about that plan.
Mhm.
They also knew about Operation Unthinkable, which was at the end of the war. Churchill thought this was impossible, but he asked his government formally to vet the possibility that using only British forces, they could fight the Soviets. The answer, of course, was, "You've got to be kidding." But the fact that he even asked his government to run the scenario was viewed by the Soviets as hostile, as well it might. Is that a sufficient answer?
Yeah, that's fine. That's great. Thank you.
Okay. So, in sum, there was a factual basis for the Red Scare of the 1950s. Venona did a wonderful job of revealing the extent of the Soviet sources within the US government. It did a very poor job of identifying those sources in particular. The government and AEC were riddled with sources who had supplied information to the USSR. But an important point was, yes, there were a large number of people who had provided information to the USSR, but it wasn't the case made by McCarthy. McCarthy claimed, for instance, that George C. Marshall and Dean Acheson were part of a broad communist conspiracy. You'll recognize George C. Marshall as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Dean Acheson as one-time Secretary of State. And there simply is no basis in Venona or in the Soviet archives that were briefly opened to the Americans at the end of the Cold War, that either of these people were sources or had anything to do with Soviet policy. To quote McCarthy, he characterized the New Deal, quote, as a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man, a conspiracy of infamy so black that when it is finally exposed, its principles shall be forever deserving of the maledictions of all honest men. Most historians remember the New Deal as a partly successive set of programs designed to preserve the USA as a non-fascist liberal democracy and a capitalist society. So that's kind of hard to understand on that basis. Between 1950 and 1952, McCarthy charged that there were 159 communists or ex-communists in the US government. John Earl Haynes has vetted that list against Venona and other sources. Out of these 159, there is substantial evidence that 9 assisted Soviet espionage against the US. Of those 159 people, only 1 appears in Venona. Only 1 appears as a source in Venona. Venona doesn't identify 6 of those subsequently uncovered by the FBI. So Venona did not support McCarthy's specific charges. It merely maintained that there had been many leaks. So in response to this, American counterintelligence agencies examined the backgrounds of hundreds of American diplomatic personnel and other agencies' personnel, trying to attach a real name to the code names in Venona of these people, but failed. The Communist Party USA dried up as a base for Soviet espionage once the administration got serious about international security and authorized the FBI and other security agencies to vigorously pursue former Communist Party membership. In the wake of the Red Scare, the FBI thoroughly penetrated the Communist Party of the USA. In response to the Red Scare, as Haynes and Clare say, there was the statute books groaned under several seasons under laws designed to outlaw dissent. I'll give one example, which is the Internal Security or McCarran Act in 1950. And this for me is the scariest provision. The act contained an emergency detention statute giving the president the authority to apprehend and detain, quote, each person as to whom there is a reasonable ground to believe, who establishes what's reasonable, that such person probably will engage in or probably will conspire with others to engage in acts of espionage or sabotage. Several provisions in the act were later overturned in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, there are some of the puzzles of Venona come out in this way. Venona was the only person to be one of few people to be unambiguously identified by Venona, was never prosecuted on this basis. Arguably, he was the second most or most important atomic spy. Moreover, although Venona was halted in 1980 and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Venona was not declassified until 1994. Many sources state that Venona was not declassified because we wanted to keep them guessing about how many networks had been penetrated. But remember, Venona was halted in 1980, and that explanation, well, maybe it makes sense through by the 1960s, but this would have been irrelevant afterwards. The messages were between 1942 and 1944. A more persuasive reason, at least to me, can be found in these references. This is the so-called Belmont Memorandum, and you can read it online. It is, to anybody's knowledge, the only known government analysis ever prepared on the utility of Venona for prosecution of suspects. It was only declassified because it was overlooked, it seems. And I know you can't read this, but I just showed that it really does exist. You can find it online. And what the Belmont memo was, it was written by the third ranking individual in the FBI, and it was a memo about the utility of Venona in pursuing a prosecution. According to it, to summarize, it was not even clear that Venona documents could be used as evidence, and this is due to the hearsay evidence rules, that is, out-of-court statements. If it was admissible, if you managed to get it admitted, Venona would be useful to corroborate government witnesses where there were such. So if Venona was the only information based on prosecution, it might not be effective. In particular, quote, the fragmentary nature of the messages themselves, the assumptions made by the code makers in breaking the messages, and the questionable interpretations and translations involved, plus the extensive use of cover names for person and places, make the problem of positive identification extremely difficult. Here again, reliance would have to be placed on the expert testimony of the cryptographers, and it appears that the case would be entirely circumstantial. Now, circumstantial evidence nevertheless does nail people, but to make it worse, the defense would probably be granted authority by the court to have private cryptographers hired by the defense examine the messages as well as the worksheets of the government cryptographers. The defense would make a request to have its cryptographers examine those messages which had been unsuccessful in breaking. It had been unsuccessful in breaking, and which are not in evidence on the premise that such messages, if decoded, could exonerate the clients. This would compromise the government's efforts in intelligence field. Also, this course of action would act to the Bureau's disadvantage, because of the additional messages would spotlight individuals on whom the Bureau has impending investigations, i.e., what if the private cryptographers were successful, whereas NSA had not been? Wouldn't that be embarrassing? Secondly, what new information would become declassified? Then finally, and most importantly, the NSA's cryptographic processes would likely be made public. But I note this to the right of the slide is a picture of William F. Friedman and Elizabeth Smith Friedman. By this time, the mid-60s, they were retiring. And I know it's counterfactual, but William F. Friedman was key to U.S. Cryptographic evidence, and he was retiring, and his wife was an extraordinarily accomplished cryptographer in her own right. What if they decided to be witnesses after their retirement? By the mid-60s, old William had a real grudge against the U.S. government because they were trying to reclassify stuff he had written in the 1920s. I don't know about you, but I would have paid good money and made a lot of popcorn to attend that hearing because old William knew where all the bodies were buried. But another reason, and this is why you always look at primary sources. If you look at the back of the memo, it says the following, to me, astonishing things. I'm going to quote the whole paragraph. Also, while no written record has been located in Bureau files to verify this, it has been stated by NSA officials that during the war, Soviet diplomats in the US were granted permission to use Army radio facilities at the Pentagon to send messages to Moscow. It has been stated that President Roosevelt granted this permission and accompanied with the promise to the Soviets that their messages would not be intercepted or interfered with by US authorities. How many of you listened to the presentation on the Zimmerman telegram? Does that sound familiar? If it had come out, that would be enormously embarrassing to the US government. So I propose, one, there were some genuine security concerns about keeping the Soviets in the dark about which networks were penetrated through the 1950s by not revealing Venona. But mostly, the FBI feared that Venona could not be used successfully for prosecution. If all you had on someone was their appearance in Venona, it wouldn't be sufficient. Also, prosecution was likely to reveal cryptographic secrets. And finally, the government was concerned that prosecution might result in the Zimmerman-like affair becoming public knowledge, which would have really been a scandal. The NSA seemed to remember the incident, even if the FBI did not, and Belmont considered the rumor credible enough to cite. So I propose that reason 1 was relevant initially, reason 2 and 3 dominated at later times. I have not seen reference to reason number 4 in any other source. I'm really kind of surprised to see it identified in an internal government memo. So we have to ask the question, now we get into the last few wordy slides. Venona is history. Venona is controversial. Venona is controversial because how likely was it that a person deemed liberal or progressive might be disloyal? To some, Venona is positive proof of the treachery of many people and of some prominent figures. To others, it's a vestige of McCarthyism. I think there's a successive generation of historians who have taken a much more informed view. But first of all, was passing defense-related information to the USSR espionage? In my opinion, in a legal system, it unquestionably was. What I've shown here is a quotation from Section 2 of the Espionage Act of 1917, which was then in force. And it quite clearly states that whoever's passing any information to any foreign government, and they identify information very broadly, is guilty of espionage. But there are some complicating factors. The USSR was formally an ally at the time, which might have been thought to blur the lines by many. The Russians had been denied a second front between 1942 and 1944, which many in the US public were demanding and which oppressed the consciences of many, which we had not delivered, i.e. the Russians are doing all the bleeding. And as Haynes and Clare say, doing something concrete and secret to help the struggle against fascism, a battle in which the Soviet Union claimed the leadership of progressive forces, attracted a number of the more adventurous spirits in Washington's new reformist political class. These are people who came in with a change of administration with the New Deal. Russian agents were often cagey in their approaches. They often said that the information they were gathering was only for the CPUSA or the Comintern and not the Soviet government. A lot of people said that was particularly important in their motivations. Now, Venona's history. What did Venona show and not show? Again, it is necessary to emphasize because I think people consistently miss that. They think, now I see the mind of my enemy, when in fact they're seeing it through some pretty cloudy glasses. Each messages seem on average less than 50% decrypted. A very tiny fraction of messages were decrypted. A maximum of 50% of those sent to the KGB in 1 year of the total sent between 1942 and 1944. Moreover, we often know little about the information that actually got to the USSR. Most of it went via diplomatic pouch, which we could not see, or via surreptitious shipment. The Russians sardonically referred to that, that is information being shipped from the US to the USSR back as reverse lend-lease. The use of cover names generally makes it hard to identify sources with corroborating data. And I don't think I emphasized this yet, the translations change substantially with time for some messages, and only the last updates have been declassified. What guesswork of conclusions and are the cover names and conclusions based on? Most of the relevant files are declassified. So you can imagine a defense attorney saying something like, so to prosecute my client, you cite differing interpretations over time of approximately one half of each decrypted message, the FBI reports on which are still declassified, within a set of much less than one half of the total messages that were sent only between 1942 and 1944. And you're not sure what information that my client allegedly passed actually got to the USSR. So if a source were prosecuted solely on the basis of Venona, it would be a dubious case. The FBI, certainly Belmont, agreed. So my conclusion is this: especially as historians, we should be careful in our accusations. It is enough to say that Uncle Frank was probably a Soviet spy, but you should be very careful about saying that Uncle Frank was a Soviet spy. That is, I think, probably yes to historical standard. If you're mentioned as a source in Venona, you are a Soviet spy. I also note that some code names refer to people that were not clearly sources, but might have been potential targets like the columnist Lippin, or relevant officials. For example, if you were to read in Venona the text, doorknob works for Magenta in the State Department, by itself, that wouldn't implicate either doorknob or Magenta as sources. Now, I hasten to say that I've only looked at 100 and not all 2,900 decrypts, and I'm not a lawyer, but my conclusions appear to be compatible with recent history. And to reiterate, there are some comparisons, not necessarily flattering, to be made with McCarthy. McCarthy's record is 6 spies identified after further investigation by the FBI, not on the basis of the information he surfaced, at a cost of 151 false accusations. It's very inaccurate and demagogic justice. In the US, we want swift justice, but we try to make it accurate. Venona said almost nothing about McCarthy's charges. It did identify one of his sources as probably guilty to a historical standard and provided no evidence against or for the other 156. It is true with Venona, to quote one of the critics, the reader is left with the implication, unfair and unproven, that every name on the list was involved in espionage. And as a result, otherwise careful historians and mainstream journalists now routinely refer to routine as proof that many hundreds of Americans were part of the Red Spy Network. Well, I believe many hundreds probably were. It's just not that they were the same hundreds as on McCarthy's lists. And there are a number of very disturbing unproven statements in the sources. For instance, here's a quote from one of them. Fact, Venona has shown conclusively that the highest level American government official working for Soviet intelligence was Harry Hopkins, unquote. Venona shows nothing of the source. Nothing of the sort. What I showed was there was one message which people infer might be Harry Hopkins, but might be any number of other people. The second statement is fact. Atomic scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer performed work on behalf of the Soviet Union, unquote. In the same book, you'll also see the director of the FBI in 1994 saying, the FBI is not in possession of any credible evidence that Robert Oppenheimer engaged in any espionage activity. Neither does Venona support that accusation. So there's, as they say, there are entries on both sides, but most sources named in Venona were quietly fired from their positions or moved aside rather than prosecuted. Now, there also is identified in some histories the accusation that Venona was a post facto fabrication by the US government to justify the Red Scare. Most historians, roughly on both sides of the debate, accept it as authentic as far as it goes, because there are too many documents one would need to forge, too many people who were involved. For my mind, the most important argument against this, surprisingly and subsequently, some information became available from FBI files via Freedom of Information Act actions, from defectors such as Alexander Vasiliev and the Haunted Wood, and most importantly, from Comintern archives in Moscow, which no one knew even existed and were declassified and became known before Venona was declassified. So most historians conclude that Venona was genuine. Another criticism aimed at Venona, mentioned in one of these texts, was that it contained only exaggerated claims of field agents trying to impress superiors in Moscow. But this is belied even if you read them casually by the fact there were elaborate Soviet procedures in place to vet sources. And in order to be accepted as a source, you had to have a lot of background. Moreover, the KGB very carefully evaluated productivity over time. Sometimes sources were dropped because they weren't delivering much. Moscow demanded an explanation when stuff that had been promised did not appear. So in sum, I pretty much buy that they are a legitimate source of information. Anyway, I bloviated at you for some time, and now I'm done. So anybody who would like me to maintain these on the screen for a long time, please say so, and I'll leave it up. But these sources are good books on Venona and background. In particular, if you want to read what I think is the best one-volume history of Venona and its impact, you would read the book by Haynes and Clare, which is #1. I think the Belmont memo is available online at this location, which I accessed recently. And if you want to know about Soviet espionage against the Manhattan Project in particular, Richard Rhodes' book, Dark Sun, or David Holloway's book, Stalin and the Bomb, are excellent sources. If you want to see the details of the vetting of McCarthy's lists and Venona's lists, that's available online as well. And the putative German-Soviet separate peace agreement is only alleged. I can only find one source on that by V. Mastny, which can be found in the American Historical Review. But other than that, I'm done, and I invite further discussion. I know this is a hot topic because I may be in effect saying that Uncle Frank was probably a Soviet spy, but it is what it is.
Okay, Mark has his hand up.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you, Sue. I apologize I came in late, but this was a wonderful presentation. You piqued my curiosity about the Operation Impossible, which I'd known about before, but I thought it was simply, and maybe this is outside your expertise. I thought it was simply basically a memo to what's his name?
Churchill?
Yeah, no, from Churchill to his main Allenbrook, his main military advisor. I thought it was just a memo. I didn't know he had presented it to the cabinet, and the Soviets found out about that. But they held to it. And what was the exact date? Do you know about that?
Well, your first statement was the only one I know is right, which is I'm not an expert source. Okay.
Fair enough.
That's fair enough, Mark. I don't know the details, frankly. What I read said that there had been a study that had been commissioned by Churchill. and that he pretty much knew the answer, but asked his staff to write up a formal answer. Do the British forces in place have any real possibility of rolling back the Soviets? And the answer was hell no.
Because I was wondering, I'll have to look this up, but I was kind of intrigued because Churchill had gone to the cabinet after Yalta, and he had pushed this, and the cabinet pushed back, saying, "No, we started this whole war because of Poland. We just can't, give it to the Soviets." And then so he's pushing this and saying, "No, we can trust Stalin," on one date, and then the next date, some months afterwards, he's asking the cabinet, "Hey, can we push them back?"
This is an excellent comment to start discussion because no, I'm not an expert on the history of the era, but that's very much the issue. That is, the fate of Poland was a real bone of contention from Yalta forward, because, as you say, Mark, ostensibly we had entered the war because of the German invasion of Poland, and the Soviets had invaded only a little bit of time later in 1939. And here we were trying to convince them to let a democratic government be elected in Poland, whereas they had seized it because they wanted a buffer against the Germans, presumably. And now they wanted it because presumably they wanted an enduring buffer against the Germans and against us. So this is the start of the Cold War. The question is whether or not there had been sufficient antecedents. I enjoy reading about, for example, the history of the Manhattan Project when Groves was working very hard to keep uranium out of the hands of the Soviets in 1944.
Thank you. Sue, would you permit one more question? But I'm more than willing
sure.
to take my turn.
Go ahead.
Okay, so David, thanks for that. Preface it by saying I took a Soviet foreign policy class my last semester of college back in 1987. And I remember at the time there was debate as to who was to blame for the Cold War. And in the US, there were people on both sides. And given what we know more and things that have come out, how do you fall on that argument or that debate? Who is really at fault?
As one of my professor, of course, I audited, reminded me, the Soviets think the Cold War started in 1919 because the U.S. and the Brits had intervened against their revolution. So, and arguably it started earlier when we actually put the steps in place to invade. So they were quite sure it was on very early in the game.
Nope.
You read about Stalin and his regime, and always the default assumption was the malevolence of the Western democracies.
Where do you fall on that debate?
I have no standing to fall one place or another, but as the little I've read suggests that Churchill was unenduringly hostile to the Soviets, as he later suggested. I'm trying to remember his quote. He said, when asked later to defend the British intervention against the Soviets in 1919, he said words to the effect of, "We should have strangled the baby in the crib."
Ooh.
So they assumed they were living with enemies from the get-go.
So can I break in for just? I mean, it seems to
please.
me this is not that complicated in a way. I mean, the Soviet Revolution had a certain degree of revolutionary zeal, about communism, how communism should in fact spread through the communism or socialism or whatever else should spread throughout the world, and it was seen. I mean, there were good reasons to think that there should be some opposition to this in the West, or at least the Western way of thinking about governments in the world. And so this is, in fact, the idea the Cold War started before World War II. One of the comments you made seems kind of silly in a way. I mean, they were never our friends. I mean, the fact that they were allies does not mean that they are friends. And in fact, today we talk about the fact that there's espionage being committed between friends, let alone between allies or enemies or anything else. So the fact that there was espionage going on between the Soviets and the United States and England or wherever is not at all surprising. Furthermore, let me just go, as an example of that fervor is, I have a number of relatives who came over to the United States in the 1900s, and they came from Russia, or Ukraine or places like that. And it was interesting to read some of the accounts, the stuff you get through your family. These people were out communists and socialists and intent. This is what they grew up with. This is what they believed. So the idea that somehow, there wasn't a pool of people in the United States who, let alone from the immigrants I'm talking about, who weren't convinced that communism was an actually a good system. For that matter, there were others who thought that fascism was a good system, and was a ready pool of ideological, supporters that might engage, or might be some of them might engage in espionage. Is not at all surprising. So there is some basis to the idea that this communist group should in fact should provide a pool of Soviet agents in the United States. Of course, McCarthy was nuts, and took it to a ridiculous extreme. He was a Trump-like figure of his own time. But I don't see where this is a difficult issue in a sense, to see how this all fits together. You have to look at it with some degree of proportionality, I guess.
No, Roy, I believe many things you said are correct. I think the correct statement is the Cold War began in October 1917.
Yeah.
But I'm dealing with the state actions. So cryptography and espionage is a state action. You have to have a state because you have it. So the fact that the state was and had antipathy towards the West from the beginning, is a noteworthy comment.
Aaron?
Yeah. So no, thank you. It was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for all the work. It's an incredible amount of work to put this together. I think one challenge becomes this void in the 1930s and into the early 40s in the United States, especially when it comes to how the United States at that point saw various, let's say, left-leaning or socialist type movements, and the type of I would say external packaging that the Soviets were able to do during that period to either obscure, what life was really like, and also just events that went on, like the Ukrainian famines, or just various horrific Soviet actions in the East, and I do think that because FDR, FDR is this unique figure, and I'd say the administration, right? It's sort of like a weird wrapping of Washington and Lincoln together, right? And it because it sort of was, right? We fought arguably the biggest war in history, through his leadership, and we in some ways redeveloped ourselves into a global superpower because of that. But at the same time,
one comment, Aaron, about the purges.
Yeah,
the purges. One thing that's fascinating to write. Maybe this refers to both Roy's comments and Aaron. One thing that's fascinating is some of the sources showing that they were individuals, not mindless ideologues, pushed back at the time of the purges. They said, wait a minute, you're asking me for information. Why should I give you information when you're killing all these people with no discernible reason? Why am I supporting you? And Moscow directed, that they were to answer these questions, quote, quite carefully, because they wanted to string these people along, and some of these people weren't buying.
Yep. No, and so I think that's one of the challenges. and we have it's a deep, it doesn't really matter where you are in history, but if you have a paleographic era or a set of leaders like that, you really kind of pretend things don't happen, or you kind of brush them aside, almost in parallel, right? I mean, you could say arguably two of the greatest structurally undemocratic actions the American leader took occurred under FDR, and by his leadership, which was his attempt to, in essence, deconstruct the senior part of the judicial system by packing the court, and then all the downstream effects that would have across all
I
the
nominate Lincoln for violating habeas corpus, but go ahead.
Yeah, but that's a civil war. Unless you just want to like put your hands up and walk around. You do make structural choices when you're actually fighting a national civil war. I consider that very different than a global war. I mean, it's just they're just two worlds. But the fact that to, in essence, rearrange the constitutional structure, basically Article 3.
Constitution says nothing. I believe Constitution does not enumerate the number of people on the Supreme Court.
It does
You
not
can change that constitutionally, and people can continually try.
So we want to accept the norm that you could have a 50,000 member Supreme Court if you want to. I mean, come on,
There's nothing in the Constitution, I believe, that specifies the number of justices in the Supreme Court.
Okay, so we just play with numbers, unlimited norms, and we just.
As I say, the debate continues because you can't just continue with the numbers, but with an absurd number. But,
okay, but that's why you have norms. That's the whole point. That's what packing the court means, is you're changing the norms structurally. So, anyways, the point is that that, and then obviously the Japanese internment, of American citizens, basically, or Japanese American citizens, and Japanese American aliens that were interned in basically camps in the United States and in obviously Canada also. Those were two extraordinary events by a historically supreme leader. At the same time, you had this very passive environment when it came to Soviet spying. I mean, it was a very permissive environment. We did not really, while we were ramping up for the war, which we understood we were, getting ready to fight, basically.
well, let's observation of fact. I mean, I was surprised to see that the FBI wasn't asleep throughout this. I mean, we could argue quite reasonably that they weren't very effective. But the reason Oppenheimer had so much trouble with security agencies was he had been on the margins of the Communist Party for a long time. So they were certainly, conscious of this threat and pursuing it. And a lot of people in the Haynes and Clare book are mentioned as having to drop out of the process because they were under surveillance. FBI surveillance, presumably FBI surveillance, or the security agencies of the different agencies they worked in. In the State Department in particular, there were people who were sidelined because they were judged to have too close a relationship with the CPUSA, and as events turned out, that wasn't a reasonable presumption. I mean, they weren't real effective, but they knew something was happening. Mark, I'm sorry, hi.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have more questions. I'm curious, when it comes to trial, and you're prosecuting someone that you think is a spy, but you're using Verona evidence. How does a trial like that go? Does it trial by jury, or how do you show that evidence without revealing your sources?
I think the FBI thought, the Belmont memo being the principal evidence I have there, that they couldn't. And in fact, they never did. Venona was never used in prosecution.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, I'm listening. I'm listening.
Because they thought, one, it was hearsay evidence, and hearsay evidence rules might prohibit its admission. If they managed to get it admitted, the defense would be likely empowered to use its own cryptographers to review methods and process, and that clearly was undesirable to the NSA. And they didn't think that if Venona was the only accusation, it wouldn't work. But they never used Venona. They never used Venona to corroborate. They always used good old-fashioned gumshoeing to corroborate because it was more certain. I saw X meeting with Y on date Z.
Okay, okay. So they would use it to target someone, follow them, and then gather the evidence.
Yes.
with that.
Venona was a way to put the puzzle together. Klaus Fuchs was identified because only a certain fact pattern fit only that individual, because the British mission to the American Manhattan Project was small, only a few people.
Can you imagine the defense lawyer, getting access to the Venona documents and start talking about how the vice president was a Russian agent? Walter Lippmann was a Russian agent just as much as my client is. The kind of uproar that could create as well, which would be undesirable.
Yeah, the FBI is a very political organization and was even then, and was not eager to start that kind of bonfire.
Yeah.
That bonfire.
Well, I mean, there was a they were really caught in a fork in the road, like in a vice grip, because you had a demagogue who was just making random charges, which was inflaming the passions at that period. And especially by that point, there was obviously a substantial suppression of Soviet spying. It was still going on, but it was it had come down dramatically because of the efforts to attack it. So there was sort of like it was almost like what he was flaming and was 10 years too late, or probably realistically 5 to 10 years too late. But to prosecute using whether you use Verona or other methods, and you would have flipped some people also, because that's just an inevitability at a percentage level. And you would have, some people are terrible with their own spycraft, so you would have captured information. So it would have been you'd had fairly strong cases in some cases. But if we had gone through with those prosecutions, pretend there was no McCarthy, and we just sort of did the prosecutions, you could argue we would just fan the flames anyways, right? Like it was going to be a fanning of these flames because of the scale of Soviet penetration.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, McCarthy was the fanning flames. I mean, you're right.
But pretend he's not around, and you prosecute, 500, or you try to prosecute 500 people, you get, whatever, 83 convictions. I mean, if you make it today, and there's the Al Qaeda party that started 20 years ago, and then 20 years later, you have 83 convictions of people who are long-term Al Qaeda spies amongst 400 or 500. That's what people focus on, right? That's that degree of penetration. And so we would have had, one way or the other, sort of a red scare. We either had one by demagogue, which was by
I think this is a good point. There would have been a red scare, so to speak, because there was a red scare.
right.
I think McCarthy got it. I speculate, Mark, I'm looking to you because I don't know the details of the era very closely, but I think McCarthy had traction because the extent of the Soviet spying came out because of several defections, but also because I suspect that not the existence of Venona, but the existence of all those investigations couldn't be kept secret. And I think a certain fraction of it leaked, and a certain fraction of it was readily visible. I mean, you did have the Rosenbergs and everybody else, and that's pouring gasoline on a political fire.
Yeah, and you also had, I mean, let's be honest, you had an investigative uh, infrastructure that, like in almost any other circumstance, would be getting frustrated that they don't see, um, you know, the right justice response.
If I'd been in counterintelligence, I would have been mad as a hatter.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like objectively, like, okay, so, we identify somebody, we have, rock solid evidence, but, we don't want to give up sources, methods. I get it. Or, whatever. That's great at the management level, but at the operator level, and then all you see is that person is just like a security guard in an empty warehouse, and nothing happens to them, and they just get to walk around. you know, I mean, that happens once, it takes a few people off. That happens 10 times, a lot of people it happens 100 times, people are saying, you know what, like we're on the wrong side of this. And so you can see those dynamics playing out, which is my thesis in the end. You were going to get a red scare because it wasn't a scare, because in the end, the scale of Soviet penetration was so large and so long, and it had so many willing members, right? I think that's the ultimate issue is, if someone kind of like a movie, flies into Long Island and sneaks into society and blah, 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 which is very rare, like, like the TV show Americans or whatever, which isn't even like that really, but whatever. It's, that's a pretty tiny number of spies, right? The reality are people who are deep believers, and that's the most challenging part
Well,
in a tribal or kinship based
yeah.
or modern civilization, is that having a traitor within your midst, um, and what that does to your
In that vein, this based on what you said, Aaron, well, this may be a very, very inflammatory statement, but one's job has a lot of often has comes along with a very compelling logical structure. That as a nuclear strategist, I would end up probably with something not too far from what exists today, and that's terrifying. If I had been a counterintelligence person at the time of the Second War, I would have denied Oppenheimer a clearance.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, just, I might not have enabled the development of the nuclear weapon at the time, but I probably, acting as a counterintelligence agency, I would never have given him a clearance.
Yeah.
I mean, his wife, his mistress,
Oh,
his
exactly.
brother were CPUSA members. He had been a CPUSA member. I mean, this is a nightmare.
Well, yeah, and you see it really in the end. Sort of the logical conclusion is what happened with the Brits, who you could argue had there was full penetration. I mean, there was so much penetration in the UK that the Soviets were fighting each other at times, because it was almost like, you could argue, almost like over penetration
There,
into the
there was a
network.
well-documented war between the KGB
Yeah.
and somewhere else trying over who was most
Right.
who took most credit
That's
for
right.
the successes of Soviet espionage against the nuclear weapons projects of Britain and the U.S.
Yep.
And certainly in Klaus Fuchs' case, I mean, he gave them everything
Yep.
at a fairly early date. They started the Soviet weapons program nuclear weapons program, sorry, started largely on the basis of Fuchs' revelations. They had good physicists who had told them the same thing. They didn't believe it, being paranoid, until they heard it from spies.
I mean, you could make a fair argument that, looking back in FDR and all the great things that he did as a leader, that the degree of Soviet espionage in the United States should be up there with one of those kind of historic failures that he had, like the Japanese American imprisonment, trying to pack the courts. I mean, it should be in that sort of list, and it doesn't really get that.
What other people think? Because I don't think that can be laid at his door. I mean, it's laid a lot of individuals' door.
Sure, but in the end, you're setting the. I mean, clearly FDR is one of the more intelligent leaders we've probably ever had, and was hyper aware politically and operationally what was going on in in our governance. And over that long period of time, clearly it wasn't news that we had a very strong subpopulation, sub-minority that of Americans that were very pro-Soviet, pro-socialist, pro-everything. And I'm sure during that period, what we did know from like Arm and Hammer and I forgot, the ATM or whatever, like the something trading company, ATC, that there was just huge amounts of sort of, I mean, it's not even just, what do you call it, espionage, just theft, just literally vacuum cleaning up anything they get their hands on. So at a certain point, you have to make a judgment, and especially as it wasn't very clear the Soviets were, quote unquote, the good guys in the 1930s with what they were doing to minority populations, and just the Red Terror type government that they had for decades. So I don't think it's a huge leap to be aware of that. I mean, we were targeting Japanese potential penetration, right? And so I don't think it was crazy to target, and we obviously had the same with the Germans, to not look at the Soviets the same way. So that's clearly a hole in that leadership. I mean, the simple answer is any foreign spying, right? Like that's the simple answer, whether it's Soviet, German, Japanese, French, whatever, is dealt with, in a very.
Mark, I'm sorry you've had your hand up. Aaron and I might dominate
Sorry.
conversation too much.
No, David, you said something rather intriguing. I want to follow up on it, that you said that the Soviets did not believe the initial information about the Manhattan Project.
Yes, sir. There's a very illuminating 2 books on that. There's Richard Rhodes' The Dark Sun, and David Holloway's Stalin and the Bomb. They were a paranoid set, the leadership of the Soviet Union, and they had a very good set of Russian physicists, including one Flerov, who wrote a letter to Stalin, which was a gutsy thing at the time, explaining that a bomb could be made, but they didn't really credit their internal discussions until they saw other people doing it. And in a real sense, the nascence of the Soviet nuclear weapons project was the fact that other people were working working towards nuclear weapons. Because you can imagine their situation. They were under attack by the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
They were extremely hard pressed at the time, particularly 1943, and they had only so many resources. And why devote them to something that no one was sure would work? Flerov said, "I am relatively sure it will work." But
Okay, well, I was asking that question to set up another question in terms of the nature of the Russian spy network in the U.S. during the war. If I had assumed that they were laser focused on the Manhattan Project, but if they found that by accident, what was the broad scope of the Russian espionage? What were they after?
they were after everything. No, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be flippant, but from the late 30s, they started looking at any sort of industrial process that could be any usage for them. They developed a broad network of engineers and scientists who were at work on this. The Manhattan Project subsumed such a large portion of that network into its work that it was essential unescapably. They fell into it by accident. And on top of that, Klaus, Fuchs, and Theodore Hall were walk-ins. They volunteered.
Yeah.
So, but they were after everything. They had Haynes and Clare are very good at dictating, at describing the width of the net. They had numerous people, aeronautical engineers, for example, chemical engineers. And they became aware of the project, I think, in addition to the walk-ins, to their network of chemical engineers who were designing the gaseous diffusion process. which required a huge number of people.
Interesting. Thank you. It
Uh,
it, it kind of goes to the, in a way, in a broader, I mean, to make a broader comment about Russia, in that the Slavophiles were really ruling in terms of in the Bolsheviks. It was Slavophiles, not Westerners. As long as you ignore Marxism being Western, a German idea, but uh, and they knew they weren't competing in technology against the West, and so they their option was, well, do we join the West? Do we drop our ideology, or do we steal from them and keep our ideology and do our best? It's like Russians, come on, join the club, guys.
I like where you're going with this, but yeah, I like where you're going with this. But it was sort of like the firm as brickwork logic of some Marxian ideology said that we were, because we developed socialism, even though we, the Russians, were technologically backward, we were at a tremendous disadvantage as Russians. So that naturally it follows you would seek aid from other people. I think you're right in pointing out that it reached such an absurd degree that they didn't believe anything unless they saw other people doing it. Did they develop the proximity fuse? No, they did not. They did snarfle up plans for
Did
the
they?
proximity fuse. Yes, indeed.
Oh, really?
One of the Venona messages, I forget which, mentions it specifically, but you would
You mean the
think,
Krytron? Is that what you're talking about?
what? Excuse me?
The Krytron? Is that what you're talking about?
Not
Proximity fuse. What do you mean by proximity
It's
fuse?
it's it's in artillery, anti-aircraft artillery, and it
Oh,
sends a radio signal, and it explodes once it detects a plane nearby. So
okay. Okay. I thought you were talking still about the bomb.
yeah,
So,
because otherwise people had to guesstimate where the height of the plane and where it was going to be. This made it a lot easier.
uh-huh.
I can't imagine timing around to explode at
Was there
10,000.
was there any mention of Camp Evans in this stuff and what
Uh,
you've read?
oh, geez. I don't remember one.
You know what I'm talking about, right? Camp Evans?
No,
There was a second project in both Britain and the United States that was equally, in many ways, is just as important as the atomic bomb
radiation lab.
project. It was called Camp Evans, and that was where they developed radar. But all the radar technology that underwent an enormous rapid acceleration during World War II.
It
Um,
was a trip to go to. I went to Harvard in the early um, 70s, and it was a trip to go down the street to MIT, where many of the buildings from the Rad Lab were still there. Where they had.
uh-huh.
And in fact, Newsweek was getting together an article in 1945 about exactly that, how radar won the war, and the extensive apparatus to develop radar and countermeasures. And then when the atomic bomb went off, they ripped out that article and wrote one about the Manhattan Project. As many physicists say, the atomic bombs ended the war, but radar won it. Why isn't the Rad Lab given the
Yeah, there
priority?
were as many brilliant physicists involved in radar development as there were in the Manhattan Project.
Yeah,
It's kind of funny. Back in the 70s, I was a graduate student at Harvard, and I was using all this technology in microwave technology for science that had been developed during the war. It was just incredible. All the wealth of devices and methods that had been
yeah.
created during that period of time.
In that vein, I was at Columbia and in up to 1973, and I was doing a junior project with T. Ivan Taylor, who had worked on the project, and I was using one of the big ballistic mass specs that he had. And I remember it had a gigantic ballistic galvanometer display on the front end of it. It was about as big as a small VW. It had been built for the Manhattan Project. They found out later the room he had working on, because he was similarly cavalier about radiation standards, was hot. So I wondered how much time I had spent in that room.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's kind of fascinating is have you ever heard of Colonel Lee, Duncan Lee, um, who was senior assistant to Wild Bill Donovan? I put a link in here. So you know, it's, I think, it's fairly strong evidence that, you know, he was an NKVD mole, and, you know, he was part of a network that arguably it was sort of like our version of a Cambridge Five, which was Elizabeth Bentley and Mary Price, Duncan Lee. You know, there was, and you know, it's pretty, pretty compelling, you know, and I think that's where Walter Lippmann got sort of pulled in, because Mary Lee was his secretary.
Mary Price.
I mean, sorry, Mary Price was his secretary, and Duncan Lee would meet Mary Price in his office. I mean, you know, sure, he could have been what do you call it? What do the communists call it? Like an unwilling sucker. Yeah, they have a term for it, right? Like I
Useful
forgot.
idiot.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, exactly. Useful idiot. So he could have, you know, been a useful idiot. That's probably the truth. But, you know, there was a pretty robust web of these spies that were, you know, pretty I'd say reasonable penetration. I mean, when you look across all the sources of power that we had at that point, whether it was, you know, aviation, the bomb program, OSS, military plans. I mean, just, you know, on and on and on. You know, inside our cabinet. I mean, it was a pretty substantial.
There's one posting on Venona that I like very much. It starts out with a declaration, "Do we have any secrets?" Question mark.
Yeah.
Hey, David, not to break the Project Impossible too much, but when and how did the Russians find out about it?
I think through the Cambridge Five, but I'm not certain. I'm not an expert on that. I know very little about the event.
Okay.
Sorry about that, Mark.
No, you can't know everything. I mean, I'm asking, you know, we've got a lot of people who know a lot of stuff. So, yeah.
It is an interesting part of history because, you know, historians in the future will note, geez, it was a very fast turnaround, you know, the Russians being allies to the Russians being sworn enemies within, like, you know, 5 years, and the process well visible well within that interval. So, you know, it's interesting how that happened.
Well, the Soviets earned that also.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, yeah, very much so. Yes,
What's-
that's I come on in regards to my question to you about whose fault it was. I'd say 90-10
Exactly.
Soviet.
what's mysterious? I mean, they ended up, you know, grabbing a whole bunch of Eastern countries.
Yeah.
You know, as simple as that. I
Oh,
mean,
and then fomenting revolutions wherever they couldn't grab the countries.
right. Yeah,
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
well, we fomented a few revolutions ourselves through the
Sure.
years, but still, I agree. I agree. I mean, I'm not, you know.
But that was more in reaction to their doing that. Before the Cold War, we did a little of that, like Haiti. We gobbled up.
I mean, you
Haiti,
could look at our
Central America.
legacy Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century. But by the time you get to 45, I mean, you know, okay, are we going to relitigate Catherine the Great in terms of Russian imperial policy, or are we going to accept sort of more modern last 10, 20, 30 years of actions? And generally speaking, in international relations and IR theory, you kind of stick to your generational period. You don't try to over deterministically, you know, you don't try to litigate, you know, Austro-Hungarian Russian treaties of the 18th century.
No, you don't. You don't. I agree. You don't do that. And I agree. There's got to be time.
There's some line out there, which I think the fair line at that point was basically World War One. Like if you're
But in that same vein, Aaron, I mean, it's interesting that, you know, the goals, and people debate how different are the foreign policy goals of the USSR how different were they from the goals of the Russian Empire before World War One? You know, when you and I were reading, you know, the Sleepwalkers,
yep,
Russia's, you know, pole stars in dealing with the Ottoman Empire were, guess what? The Straits.
Yep.
And warm water.
Well, so I would say their Western goals and their Central Asian, you know, whatever you would, I don't know what the right plural of that is, but whatever, Catherine the Great's sort of Russian imperial geography, right? Like that range is, for most people, the last few hundred years, sort of the broad accepted sphere, right? The idea of the Soviets, well, now the Russians, obviously, having robust, arguably near colonial, at least militaristically colonial relationships in Africa. I think that one sort of is a stretch relative to the sphere, the scale of natural intention, intentionality of Russian historical power. Right, that's a modern construction, right? Like Catherine the Great never viewed, Africa as a colonial possession, right?
She
That was,
didn't have the means.
no, it doesn't matter if you had the means. Like you still, like at the end of the day, like at an instrumentation level, she didn't, that wasn't, or that era's, those few hundred years in terms of Russian intentions, eventually, was not that. And then under Soviet intentions, it was global, right? I mean, it was a global revolution to overturn, world order, to make it a, Marxist Leninist paradise, whatever that means. And
Whatever that means.
Many people have debated to what extent the ideological end of it, which I agree is huge, would be different language for imperialistic concerns. Does the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics really look a lot different from an empire? I mean, right now, I don't purport to be a global, what do you call a geopolitician. I have no credentials whatsoever, and I don't know enough to think so. But they're trying to grab slash fear China, fearing Japan, wanting the Straits, trying to get a buffer. These people detect these ongoing, themes in how the country, views the rest of the world.